Today, we up the ante with incredible speakers. Next one up is Mimi Hoang with nARCHITECTS, and it's my great pleasure and my honor to do a short introduction, which is almost unnecessary since I think everybody on this Zoom has either read the bio on the website or knows of their work. I'll do it anyway with maybe a little bit of a personal elaboration. As you all know, Mimi co-founded nARCHITECTS with Eric Bunge in 1999 with the belief that architecture can be an agent for positive change, responding to and connecting people with the environment in unexpected ways. It's based in Brooklyn, a studio that works both nationally and internationally on new buildings, transformations, and public spaces. The initial impetus to the practice was founded to address contemporary issues in architecture through conceptually driven, socially engaging, and technologically innovative design work. The firm partners with public agencies, cultural institutions, developers, and private clients to design architecture that aligns with a changing world. More personally, Mimi was born in Vietnam and trained in Amsterdam and New York City, and therefore brings a very global outlook and perhaps an obsession with greenery to the firm's design culture. She teaches graduate design studies as an Adjunct Associate Professor at Columbia's GSAP, my alma mater, and she previously taught at Yale, where I spent some years as well. So we overlap, not quite, but subsequently she received a Master of Architecture from GSD at Harvard and a Bachelor of Science in Design also from M.I.T. She regularly lectures on the work of architects and participates in symposia on all sorts of topics ranging from urban living and density to new housing models and alternative construction methodologies. I think, the history of the firm, in case we don't get into it during the presentation, gained national attention in 2004 with the canopy at MoMA PS1, Long Island City, made out of green bamboo that was subsequently reused. And subsequently, I think the year after, building a very well-publicized, well-designed building called the Switch Building and Gallery in Lower Manhattan. These early projects set the stage and continued up until the project that brought the firm primarily to my attention, which is known now as Carmel Place, but was the response to the competition that took place at the Center for Architecture, at least took some physical form there, to look at micro units. And the fact that their scheme was both micro and modular has had a lasting impact on everything from the zoning resolution to the market for housing that is meeting the needs of people who are either living alone or looking to live in more communal or smaller space. I'm going to skip a lot of what's on here because I really want to hear from Mimi, not from me. Many awards, many projects all over the world that I could describe, including Navy Pier, including a new museum and a new library in Shanghai that I think is 1.2 million square feet. But I want to flag two things. One, the book in 2018, Buildings and Almost Buildings, that was published by Actar. It's a quote-unquote subtle manifesto about the formal and social potential of an architecture that remains open-ended. And then more personally and more recently, in February of this year, nARCHITECTS was selected by the New York City Department of Design and Construction to be part of the Project Excellence Program with a design term contract. DDC's Project Excellence Program, which I ran until a few years ago, establishes expectations and goals for quality and innovation in architecture, engineering, and project delivery. Program utilizes strategies and practices that balance aesthetics, functionality, cost, constructability, and durability to bring form and meaning to public space. That's what nARCHITECTS does day in and day out for public and private projects. That's what Mimi does. And we're so glad, Mimi, that you're here next door up at Columbia to talk to those issues and more. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rick. And thank you, Natalia, so much for the invitation. Super happy to be here. Just to tell you a little bit more about our office. We're small. We are about a dozen people. And we have, in the recent years, mainly been working on buildings in the public and civic realm, as well as housing. And so in, out, at, on buildings is loosely about the many different conditions and contexts that shape what and how we design, specifically how we address our sites, their visible and invisible contexts and histories, social histories, and how we transform them. But it's been a strange couple of years. And so I also wanted to share our work through the lens of books that have inspired me to materialize personal motivations. I have been reading a lot during COVID, mainly reading the voices of women and minorities in literature, social history, and environmental fiction, and reflecting on how I teach, practice, and communicate our ethics to society at large. So this is a mini talk and kind of a retroactive manifesto and a roadmap for our future as a practice, which asks, how do we respond to this extremely fragile moment in time? And how can architecture become an agent of and for positive change? So the first project is about a search for form through a deep understanding of sites. And what I mean by sites is the physical, hidden historical, and social context. This is the New York State Equal Rights Heritage Center. It's in a small town, upstate New York, central New York. It's in a region called the Finger Lakes region, which has been central to the struggle for equal rights and the suffragette movements. Our research for this project into Central New York's history and key figures led to readings about the Great Migration and the Underground Railroad. And in these books, the way in which the individual narratives and the embodied intimate voice are woven between broader historic frameworks really clarified the need for us for deep research into the communities for which and with whom we design, which is not a universal public or a homogeneous community, but for bodies with very specific narratives and motivations that stem from their local and migrant contexts. So here's the site. It's an extremely critical historic site in the town of Auburn. It's the first municipal building that they built in 40 years. And so there was a lot of anxiety, also because it sits in between many historic structures. So in the background, you see a historic Westminster Church and the YMCA. To the left is William Seward's house. He was the Secretary of State for President Abraham Lincoln. To the right is a brutalist parking garage that nobody liked. And behind is City Hall. So in a sense, we had two different contexts: the physical context, the historic buildings, and the social context, and the past and the present for both the physical and the social context. And here you see bits of the exhibition and some key figures in the struggle for equal rights. This is a snapshot of what we call our landscape of inefficiencies, which is how we start every project, through a search for formal and urban typology that really synthesizes contemporary and historic contexts into something more open and participatory. We struggled because all along this road are all the historic manners, neoclassical, neo-Georgian, federal style manners. But we were building a new center. And so how do we reconcile the kind of domestic scale with the institutional scale? So we analyzed those houses, looked at how the kind of volumes break down in mass, and conceived of 4 hinged volumes that open up to frame views of the historic context of City Hall, of the Seward House Museum, and of the church. And we really understood this project as a kind of physical portal, as well as a virtual portal that links present day with the past. We organized the building as a series of cores within a larger volume. So we packed everything that is fixed into the cores. And so that the exhibition and the experience of the exhibition is more of a meandering path around the cores. And each volume handles different themes from the exhibition. So zooming in a little bit, the exhibition is separated by formats and media, as well as themes, which starts with an introduction to the state and then goes further into the different historic movements. So when you enter, this is the vestibule. It points you towards all of the other historic sites in the town, including the homestead of Harriet Tubman, who was extremely important during the struggle for equal rights and a key figure in the Underground Railroad. So this is a kind of literal link to present day Auburn, to those historic homesteads. At the reception desk, you can take a right or a left. We will take a left. The area that we are in is called the Finger Lakes region for 5 lakes that are shaped like fingers. And so this first exhibition area is a kind of survey overview of the region, and the bench is the exact bathymetry of one of the lakes. And this is one way in which we are trying to always connect the experience of our architecture with a much broader context, whether it's physical or historic. The next piece that you encounter is what we call the speech island. And there are recordings of historic speeches, but when we couldn't find a recording, we re-recorded the speech through with the voices of the community, school children and members of the community. And in that way, try to materialize the present day voices of the community and bridge the past in that way. The next piece is what we call the social justice table, which is a digital timeline and also an interactive one. And you can see from the table a view of William Seward's house through one of these hinged openings. And that is the same hinged opening from the outside looking back to that area. You can see the social justice table and the speech island. And then this is the other hinge on the other side where you see through the building and out again beyond to William Seward's house. And so these are these moments as you meander around the exhibit that take you, that focus you on the exhibit that is on the core versus the context that is beyond. And it's this oscillating rhythm that we were interested in. The other context is the culture of brick. Harriet Tubman supported and employed the indigent African-American community at her brick factory in Auburn. They crafted the bricks that clad the numerous structures on her homestead and beyond. And so the brick is a veneer where we looked at some historic details and we incorporated them in a contemporary way. But we were also responding to the construction timeline, which was extremely fast. We had 6 months to design and 10 months for construction because the governor had to cut the ribbon before Election Day. And so we were interested in a more very simplified layering system. So the concrete, the structural concrete is the finish on the inside, and the roof is framed with mass timber, and that was framed in 2 days. And in general, we're just trying to minimize layers from a sustainability standpoint also. This is Harriet Tubman. She graces the plaza in front of the building. And so our choice of brick is really stemming from an entanglement of our site's socioeconomic and historic, socioeconomic networks and historic and contemporary building culture, and also rethinking some opportunities for material invention. Since the center opened, it has really become Auburn's living room, and everything happens there. Talks, school groups, performances, different stakeholders come and hold their meetings there, community groups hold their meetings there. And out of all the projects that I have been to in terms of opening day, I would say that this was my favorite, because hundreds of members of the community showed up, and it really felt like we were making a difference to their town. And so for us, our approach to form is not abstract. It's not an isolated discourse, but we approach it as spaces that are accessed and appropriated by different social communities. And so form and context are far from neutral. The second project explores a reciprocal relationship between architecture and landscape and community. With the rise of climate activism and the generation of Greta Thunberg, our briefs have expanded to consider the impact of buildings on human, plant, and animal ecologies. Can buildings touch the earth with lighter footprints? Eco-anxiety is a thing. It doesn't just impact the young, it cuts across age, ethnicity, and political spectrums. Apparently, almost 3/4 of us experience some degree of anxiety over climate change, including me. And I have been finding refuge in climate and eco-fiction, which can realign our ideation of nature and reveal the inequities of our collective rights to it. I have read urgent calls to action to connect the planetary scale of climate change to the human scale of the communities that bear its consequences. I find it can be hard to act, especially after I read the overstory and felt very guilty for using any wood, but we can also be agents for better stewardship of our environment. So this is the Jones Beach Energy and Nature Center. Our ethos in our practice can pretty much be summarized in terms of do more with less material, less weight, less negative consequences for the environment. Jones Beach is on a barrier island, which was designed to protect the mainland. This is our site, which actually had an existing building on it. We ended up cutting 1/3 of this concrete parking lot. This is one end of our site, very, very popular public beaches. On our end, it's much more natural with sensitive habitat. It actually started, so this is the new site design. The parking lot was up to that line here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it was a good bit more. We cut it out and we used the rubble to elevate the building above the floodplain. It started as a small renovation of a bathhouse, but then we acquired 2 clients, New York State Parks and then the local power authority. And so we worked with them to merge the goals and mission of the building and how nature and energy concerns are mutual concerns. And so the plan is organized. This is another landscape of inefficiencies, trying to figure out how to create variety along 330 linear feet, sorry, that's the length of the building. It's organized in terms of cores, which house the compact fixed program, and in between is the exhibition. That is linked by a long linear gallery that is also open to the outside. And this was important because much of the exhibition is actually outside into the landscape and stretched out along the shaded trellis. But also it's not just the exhibition, but the educational component. So this is a site for school kids and families, and this is their outdoor classroom. And it's also along a trail, a nature trail. And so many people come here just on their bikes, walking or bird watching. And this is their porch. We wanted it to feel like a very big, publicly accessible beach hut. So this is the entry. Upon entry, you see straight to the water. This is because we elevated the building on the rubble of the old concrete. So now you can see the water, whereas before you couldn't. And then this is the linear gallery that connects the different gallery zones. And this is another use of timber for the roof framing and decking, and quarry tiles for the floor, again, to make it feel like a very warm beach hut with beautiful exhibits, which we didn't design. The exhibit space is illuminated by the sawtooth. It worked so well that on opening day, we actually didn't have power because we couldn't get power in time, but nobody noticed because it was very illuminated at night. So this is, an example of a project where climate considerations, the wind, sun, sea levels, literally shape the architecture and the identity of the center. It's not just another layer of a requirement for us, but a conceptual driver that shapes the morphology and the experience of architecture. And our collaboration with the client on this is an example of how we can rethink institutions and the capacity for architecture to encourage us to become better stewards of our environment. We've also been exploring alternate models for working and living that are connected to broader city initiatives that seek a more equitable city. The past few years have exacerbated the social, technological, and economic inequities for the working class. And we have been interested in designing spaces for production and manufacturing, which have been slowly disappearing from the city. And this is in collaboration with Natalia. This is Made in New York campus for the garment workers. We're renovating 2 warehouses into manufacturing hubs for the garment workers. This is a site that, when it was built in the early 1900s, it was a revolutionary intermodal shipping, transport, and storage facility. But as rail disappeared and since the port moved to New Jersey, these piers slowly disintegrated into the water. And so now we have an opportunity to connect buildings that did not front the water, that now front the water. So this is the historic photo of the buildings that we're renovating. They were never meant for work. They were storehouses for dry goods. And so this is the historic and layers of transformation. Cuts at some point were introduced, concrete spandrels were introduced. This was the existing condition that we inherited, very closed on the ground floor. And so our challenge was, how do we support the garment workers by introducing more porosity, allowing them to bring their goods down to the ground, introducing these cuts in the second floor to create double height spaces and make their work more visible, more participatory. And this is a little old. It looks a little bit better now, but we're still in construction. That's an image of the cut that we made on the ground floor and the double height spaces that we created in order to create space for display, for fashion shows, for the garments to be brought down and shared with the wider community, for shared amenities like lab spaces on the second floor. So the rendering was a view looking down. This is from that same space, but looking up. And you can see how we are keeping a lot of the existing building because for us, we didn't want a very clear divide between new and old. We're more interested in the layers of new and old and acknowledging that these buildings are transforming once again. And the waterfront is transforming once again from an industrial waterfront to now still industrial, but incorporating some public realm space, and which reflects the wider change of waterfronts throughout the city. Formerly, considered an edge of the city and marginalized because of the environmental pollution from industry, or marginalized because the city did not want to see workers, literally did not want to, have workers seen, because the garment district was previously on Fifth Avenue. And we are interested in making work and workers more visible to the public and making their activities participatory. The last project I will share with you is Carmel Place. It's an instance of rethinking how we build spaces for living in the city. It was the result of a public competition that Rick mentioned called Adapt NYC. The point of the competition was to try to address the housing shortage in the city. But it starts with this book by Jacob Riis called How the Other Half Lives. He was a Danish photojournalist, and he published this book in 1895. He turned his camera onto the dire living conditions of the working class. At the time, it was half of the city's population. And he exposed the lack of light and air, the lack of proper sanitation, the lack of proper leases, and the lack of suitably sized spaces. And so it's important to understand that the regulations that we have now for housing are born out of this work. The paradox, so I'm saying that the minimum size of apartments, the minimum size for windows, etc., is based on this work. The paradox is that while the American home has been ballooning, almost double what it's been since the 50s, the American family has been shrinking, not just in New York, but nationally. And so the nuclear family is now in the minority, and there are just much more complicated household structures, including the rise of small households. Manhattan is at 46%, New York City is at 33%. It is not just a national phenomenon, it's also a global phenomenon. And in the city, the housing stock has not kept up. And so we have 1.8 million small households in New York, but only 1 million suitable apartments. And so this is New York City Planning Commission and DOB taping out a 300 square foot apartment. This is not our project, but this was done leading up to the Adapt NYC competition. The other aspect of the project for us was modular construction, which I think helped us win. This is the, so far in Manhattan, the tallest modular construction that is primary construction. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So that was the rendering. This was the opening, 2016. For us, it was not just about how do we design a good small unit, but how do we rethink how you live in an apartment building with micro units. And so we thought about the idea of the dispersed home, where we disperse the amenities throughout the building. And so we treated these amenities as we located them in the most visible areas and to encourage their use and to encourage interaction between the residents, because just because somebody wants to live by themselves, it doesn't mean that they want to be lonely, which is the other phenomena that we are trying to counteract. So this is the gym, used to be the gym that opened to the sidewalk. And this is our David and Goliath context. We were in a brick bowl in Manhattan. We had two sites. one in the factory and one on site. And so in the factory, we would approve each unit line before it was released. This is kind of the timeline of that production, starting with the steel chassis, becoming more and more complete, and then it rolls out the factory floor to the lower right of that image. So when the units leave the factory, they leave at midnight and they cross the Brooklyn Bridge to avoid traffic. But pretty much everything is there, including almost all of the finishes. They leave the corridor side open. All the finishes are there. The lights are in place. Mechanical units are in place. Plumbing fixtures and plumbing is in place. The insulation and the windows are in place. So what happens on site is the brick veneer and all of the connections. So that made it look very easy. It wasn't, but the stacking process was only 3.5 weeks. These are the typical units on a floor, including the elevator and the stair. That's also a prefab unit. So the units include the units and a little bit of the corridor. And then what they leave open is the drywall on the corridor side. And it literally kind of goes together like Legos. They kind of lock together. All of the plumbing, et cetera, and mechanical is on the corridor side. That's what they're connecting on site. And each of the units is self-supporting. So when they come together, you get double walls and double floor and ceiling between the units. They're on average about 300 square feet net. So we shrank, and the minimum by code is 400. So we shrank the floor area by 25%, but the ceilings are 9'8". So we only shrank the volume by 10%, which is important to note because they feel good. The windows are actually sliding doors. They are 8 feet. I'm sorry, I don't think in metric. I try, but I can't. And so, you know, and all the windows go down to the ground. We always were trying to connect the experience of the unit to the outside and to the street activity. While we shrank the living space and the sleeping area, we did not shrink the kitchens and bathrooms. Those are all compliant and those are all ADA accessible, which kind of shows you how it kind of looks like a building of kitchens and bathrooms. But this is a kind of animation of how we imagined the life of the building. There are 55 units. 40% were affordable. So that's 22 units. 8 of them went to formerly homeless veterans. That leaves 14 units up for the public lottery. For those 14 spots, I think HPD received 60,000 applications, which is terrible, which means that we need to build more affordable housing. So on the outside, it stitches the environment together from the light brick neighbor to the dark brick neighbor. And so the exterior was conceived as 4 slender towers, like a microcosm of the city. And I'm going to stop there. I think I ran over a little bit, and I will stop sharing so that you can take it away with questions and answers, and my answers.
I want to thank you for an amazing
Rick,
presentation.
you're on mute, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You could come into my room and we could do it together.
I'll have to do it. I'll be right.
Rick just needs to walk 20 feet. Okay, he's coming.
Hello, Mimi. I could hear him well.
This is
I
this
don't
is
know
actually
how-
a better way of doing the program.
Natalia, you
No
are also
offense to the
on
organizers, but yeah, there was some. My computer didn't say I was on mute, but it certainly was muted. So here we are in this lovely room that you can't see because of the virtual background. And I just wanted to, I don't have my notes now, but I wanted to thank you for a great presentation. Especially, here I'm using a book culture mug that you probably see, it's not virtual. And I just came from the Strand where I bought some books for my grandkids. And the idea that you could inform the design process through not only historical context of the site and perhaps even the history of materials used, environmentally appropriate materials, which of course you're doing, but also that there are fundamental cultural forces that are at the root of what we do as architects and how people experience, understand, and appreciate the space. In all the projects that you showed us today and in others that you've done that there wasn't time for, that was really, really, really clear. I know a little bit more about the Adapt NYC competition because the diagram, thank you for showing it, was on the floor of our basement.
That's you.
No, yeah, I think the photo, there was one picture of me in the Wall Street Journal standing in the bathroom because they were saying bathrooms that are tiny. I said, well,
Is this livable?
Right. But what you did was so far beyond that sketch, which we didn't design at the center. I think it was Alex Washburn probably gets most credit for that. The idea that housing should relate to how people live and that has changed over time, that yes, single person households, absolutely, but you go deeper into that than perhaps time allowed, and issues of the elderly on fixed income and dealing with the angst and anxieties of living and cooking alone, of young people who are sick and tired of friends and sharing places and sleeping on a couch in the living room and putting up a partition that gets rid of the common space. And then you showed spaces that I've not been able to, not for lack of trying, see inside, including the porch with the gym. And the idea that there is enough left over when you make the spaces smaller. So my question in all that is, that was partially a response to a program that said you could reduce from nominally 400 to nominally 300 square feet. I know the numbers are slightly different. And it was partially a provocation that challenged not only government officials and the zoning czars, but to the market to say, this is doable. Have you seen in your work subsequently, including other places where more communal style housing is possible, that the market has shifted because of that? Or do you think, the pandemic may be a counterindication when people needed, if anything, more space to work at home?
Yeah, I think that, what I've seen is, we haven't done micro units since, and we are, but we're always kind of thinking of, looking at how things have shifted. I think that exterior space, in general, is a rarity for New York apartments and has become even more in demand. Even if it's just a balcony. I think that the compartmentalization of apartments has also become a thing I see in listings. Zoom room, Zoom closets, but I think that, that also, I've seen it in the shared spaces, where often in mixed use development, the shared spaces are these big kind of TV room, media room, with a big pool table, and you never see anybody in it. And now, recent examples that I've been to, you see more kind of home office amenities. So, if you need to escape your apartment, is there a kind of meeting room, this kind of thing? It's not really for leisure, it's for work.
Well, the other thing that the site context photo, the aerial shot that showed not only the difference in scale, which makes it more human, more humane, eyes on the street and all that, surrounded by very tall buildings near the Bellevue Hospital complex. There's also a kind of a mini plaza, kind of a cut through that is verdant and has street furniture that relates to and animates a coffee shop at the base of the building.
Mhm.
And of all the retail uses possible in New York City, what a great location. So the social space
Mhm.
extends even into the choice, deliberate, accidental, market-driven, or otherwise of a place of congregation. You can be there
Yeah.
alone. I was, but
Yeah.
you could also, meet neighbors for a cup of coffee without having to go into, the micro unit. So it's not the only project we're going to talk about. I grew up not too far from Jones Beach, and the transformation of parking lots into facilities that are driven by their environment and relate to new needs and different needs than maybe Robert Moses envisioned when the place opened is great. But it's not just about the work; it's about the approach to the work. And what can you describe the starting point? How many, apart from the literature review, which is amazing, what kind of conversations do you and your team have with people, beyond the clients?
I mean, the literature, just to really, put it into context. The literature is not always before the project. A lot of it is especially what I showed today. A lot of it was after. And for me, that's why I kind of said the talk is a kind of retroactive manifesto, because, the desire to improve, living for communities has always been there in some sort of hazy, expression, right? That, we are designing for communities. The literature just helped me crystallize the nuance of that, but in general, what I didn't speak about so directly is that we are obsessed with the engagement of architecture in its urban or natural environment. And so we are always trying to think of, how does landscape come in? How does the environment, the daylight, ventilation, etc., come in? How does our work reframe the context that it's sitting in, which is more of an inside out? So the simple answer is that we are always kind of having conversations about what is the outside in terms of all the forces and the environmental conditions and the community, etc., and what is the inside out in terms of impact, what it's messaging, what do people take away after their visit, and how do we think of architecture not as objects that sit on their site, but as part of whether it's the urban infrastructure or the social infrastructure or the ecological infrastructure. How does it do that?
So I'm looking at the tiny little clock in the bottom right corner, and we're pretty much out of time. And I'm sure Natalia has questions that are going to be coming from members of the audience or
There's no question from the public for Mimi, but I have to say that I had the pleasure to work with Mimi. Definitely amazing opportunity, because the work you do is amazing, and the way you work with people as well. So that's been a really good experience. We worked, as you said, together in a project that has to do with, is an industrial building, but also close to the water. And we had Ken Uber from Langen give us some insights on what's going on with buildings that are close to the water. That's the problem that New York has. And, I wanted to emphasize, because it's part of the city, and how we have to address the environmental problems that we're having, and that we have been having for a long time. And so if you can tell us a little bit of your experience in terms of resiliency in New York.
I feel like 3/4 of our projects in New York deal with resiliency, with sea level rise. And I think it's a real challenge, because so we have to protect those buildings. It's a challenge because at the same time we are trying to introduce openness and accessibility and visibility, right? And so, you know, sometimes we can handle it with some, you know, if the floodplain is just a couple feet, you know, we can handle it with some creative window layouts that, you know, still maximize visibility, but don't let the water in. But sometimes, as in the case of the Made in New York campus, you know, it's so close to the waterfront that, you know, then you just have to protect all of the openings, etc. And but the better way to do it, which to be honest, we haven't had the chance to do because it's always more costly, is to protect the district. And we tried to do it on the Made in New York campus. And this is an instance where this is city property, right? We tried to protect, you know, a couple of buildings, which is less expensive. To protect a couple of buildings, it's not less expensive, but it is just, you know, a limitation because sometimes, you know, the city is not ready to think on that scale. That requires planners. And often these projects are done one building at a time. So that's just real challenge, you know.
Yes, and what Rick, you have some, well, one of the things that I've seen with that particular project is that, you know, you're trying to renovate a building with not too much money, and then suddenly protecting the building is so costly that you know, sometimes that's the main problem with all the buildings on the waterfront. How much money you need to invest on protecting them from the water in case of, you know, rising levels of water. And it's happening very often, so it needs to be a consideration. And you know, in all the tools that we have to protect the buildings are, you know, very expensive, or they actually requires a lot of people mounting walls, and, you know, in a moment that is dangerous, you know, like you see all these systems available in the market in which you need 10, 20 people sometimes in the site trying to protect a building. Well, they need to protect themselves. So that's very challenging, and invite, you know, companies to think about different systems to protect the city, and that they don't require human workforce to do so, no?
The point of the Bush terminals initially, when they were built, was the connection between waterborne merchandise deliveries and, you know, it was warehouse, basically, changing purposes along the waterfront, whether they're new cultural facilities, new housing, manufacturing, bring their own challenges. You know, to say that everything is costly, I think avoids the opportunities that changing uses bring to the fore. They may not have the same ground floor or lower level uses, but, you know, in the same way that park design along the waterfront sometimes has sacrificial space that allows the water to come in and come out. I think, you know, we're on the verge with such an intense national focus, international focus on water that can't be stopped, you know, as we heard from Ken Huber last night. And looking at different types of typologies, very easy to do for new buildings, somewhat more tricky for existing buildings. But the reinforcement of the existing stock for environmental reasons should be a real opportunity for creative minds, and glad that, you know, you and Eric are at the top of the list in getting this work. But
yeah, I mean, you know, the waterfront, you know, the 1900s, early 1900 waterfront was not meant for people. You know, it was meant for not for the public, you know, and so it's there's so many pressures on our waterfront, more public space, more housing, and also to keep the manufacturing that had been kicked out of the center of Manhattan to retain them also. So yes, I feel guilty whenever I look at the price tag of this project, but really, a third of it is for resiliency.
Definitely. Well, we need to close the lecture now. Thank you so much, Mimi. I know how busy you are.
Thank you, Natalia. Congratulations on the biennial. Super honored to be part of it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Rick. You disappear now, but
it's a virtual. I'm not really here, but it is a pleasure to be part of it. And thanks to all the organizers and especially to you, Natalia, for your leadership.
thank
Bye.
you. Have a
Take
good
care.
day.
Bye.
Bye bye.